I'd been living in the Appalachian Mountains for about 6 months, renting an old cabin just off the beaten path. I'd wanted peace and quiet, a place to clear my head, you know? The kind of place you imagine when you picture escaping from the noise of the world. But as much as I thought I was prepared for solitude, nothing could have prepared me for what happened that night. It started like any other evening. The air was cold, one of those bone-chilling nights where the fog rolls in thick, clinging to everything. The smell of wet earth and pine trees filled the air. I was sitting by the fire reading when the house started to creak. I'd gotten used to it. Old cabins do that. It's the kind of thing you ignore unless it's the middle of the night and you're suddenly aware of every sound. Around 9:30, the light above the kitchen sink flickered and then went out entirely. Now, it wasn't unusual for old lights to burn out in this cabin. The wiring was ancient. But this particular bulb had just been replaced a few days ago, and I remember thinking it shouldn't have gone out so soon. I didn't think much of it at first. I got up, grabbed a flashlight from the drawer, and made my way to the kitchen. As I reached the hallway, I noticed something strange. The temperature had dropped and the air felt heavier, like I was walking through something thick. Not the kind of heavy you get from humidity, but something that made me feel like I was intruding on something else. It made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, but I shrugged it off. The kitchen was dark, only lit by the faint light of my flashlight. The bulb above the sink was definitely out, but there was something else. The shadows seemed wrong. Not just because of the lack of light, but because of the way they shifted. I tried not to focus on it, turning the flashlight towards the breaker panel instead. The switch for the kitchen light was fine. No issues there. That's when I heard it. A sound, barely audible, almost a breath, but coming from the corner of the room. I froze. My heart started to race, and I turned slowly. My flashlight flicked across the corner, and I could swear something moved, just out of the beam's reach. My hand tightened around the flashlight, my thoughts racing. It was probably just a shadow, maybe something in the room casting it strangely. But still, my pulse quickened, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I stood there for a few more seconds, my breathing steady but quick. Nothing. I turned back to the breaker panel, resetting the switch for the light. It flickered back to life, the hum of the bulb filling the room, and everything seemed normal again. I shook my head, trying to laugh it off. The isolation was probably just messing with me. I headed back to the living room, my steps echoing in the quiet house. But before I could sit back down, I heard it again, a faint breath. This time, it was right behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing there. The room was empty. I don't know why, but my mind jumped to the window. I stepped over to it, pulling the curtain back just enough to peek outside. There was nothing but fog, the kind that settled thick across the forest, swallowing everything whole. I let out a breath, wondering what I was even thinking. I told myself it was just the wind playing tricks on me. But then I saw something in the reflection of the glass, a shadow that shouldn't have been there. It was just a glimpse, but enough to make my stomach drop. It wasn't mine. It was too tall and too still. I didn't know what to do. My legs felt like they were made of stone, frozen in place, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the window. My heart was pounding so loudly in my ears I could barely hear anything else. The shadow moved, not in the reflection. It was outside. I didn't wait to see more. I pulled the curtain back down and backed away, my mind screaming at me to leave, but my body refusing to move. My breath came fast, shallow, and I could feel the walls closing in. I grabbed my phone from the table, my fingers fumbling as I tried to call someone, anyone. But my signal was dead. Of course it was. No surprise there. Then the creaking started again, louder this time, moving from the hall into the living room. I couldn't move. My mind was spinning in circles, and for a second I thought I was imagining things. But the creaking was real. It sounded like someone was walking through the hallway, slow and deliberate. The floorboards groaned with each step, and I could hear the faint drag of something heavy moving across the floor as though someone was dragging their feet. I wanted to yell, to shout out, but my throat felt tight, like all the air had been sucked out of the room. I tried to convince myself it was the house settling, that the weight of the fog outside was just pressing down on the cabin, making everything feel off. But it didn't make sense. It didn't explain the slow, measured steps coming closer and closer. I turned toward the kitchen, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The beam bounced erratically, but I couldn't stop it. My eyes kept flicking back to the hallway, waiting for something, anything to move in the shadows. But there was nothing. Not yet. I didn't dare take another step. My heartbeat was so loud I thought it would give me away, but I couldn't help it. I felt like I was being hunted. That sense of being watched was overwhelming now, thick like the air in the room. Then I saw it. Just a flicker at the edge of the hallway, a shape emerging from the darkness. It wasn't a person, at least not in the way I understood it. It was taller, broader. I couldn't make out any details, just a dark figure that seemed to absorb the light around it, like it didn't belong. My throat tightened, and I instinctively backed up, nearly tripping over the rug in the living room. I grabbed the nearest chair for balance, but it wasn't enough. My legs felt weak, my body frozen, like the air itself was holding me in place. The figure didn't move at first. It just stood there, watching. I could feel its eyes on me, but I couldn't see its face. There was no sound from it, just the strange feeling of its presence. Every inch of me screamed to run, but I didn't. I watched, breathless, as it took a slow step forward. The floor creaked under its weight, but it didn't stop. It came closer, and my pulse started to race faster, louder. Something was wrong. This wasn't just my mind playing tricks. This wasn't a shadow or the wind. This felt real. My instincts kicked in, and I moved, quickly, as fast as I could. I turned, bolting for the door. The chill in the air hit me all at once, and I knew it was either the cold or the panic that made me shiver, but I didn't care. I just needed to get out. I didn't make it. As I reached the door, I felt a sudden pressure on my chest, as though something invisible had pushed against me. I gasped, stumbling back. The flashlight dropped from my hand, its beam fading as it rolled across the floor. My heart pounded in my ears, and the cold seemed to wrap tighter around me. I looked back to the hallway, but there was nothing, no figure, no movement, just the empty darkness of the cabin. But the air still felt heavy. I couldn't breathe. I could barely think. My body was moving on its own now, frantic and desperate. I stumbled to the window, trying to see outside, but the fog was thick, too thick to make anything out. I pulled the curtain back, but nothing had changed. The shadow was gone, and I almost convinced myself I had imagined the whole thing. That was until I turned back. The door had closed, by itself. I didn't remember closing it. I had barely touched it. I stood there, staring at the door as it seemed to settle into place. The darkness of the hallway beyond felt deeper now, as though the shadows themselves were swallowing the cabin whole. My hands shook as I reached for the door handle. I didn't want to open it. I didn't want to look again. But I had to. I needed to make sure I wasn't going crazy. I pulled the door open slowly, barely enough to peek through. The hallway was empty, but there was something on the floor, something small and barely noticeable, sitting just beneath the edge of the door, a piece of paper. I bent down, hesitant. My fingers brushed against it. And for a moment, I thought I could hear a whisper, but it was so faint, I couldn't tell if it was my imagination or something else. The paper was folded, creased in a way that looked deliberate. I opened it slowly with a sense of dread building inside me. The writing was simple, sharp, as if it had been scrawled in haste. I'm waiting. I dropped the paper. My breath caught in my throat as I stepped back. There was no one in the hallway. No footsteps, no breath, no sound. Just the cold, heavy silence pressing in on me. I didn't know what to think anymore. The cabin had felt like home when I first arrived, a place of peace and quiet. But now it felt different, darker. The shadows were thicker, and no matter how many lights I turned on, they never seemed to chase away the chill. I locked the door, but I didn't feel safe. I didn't feel safe anywhere, and I haven't been able to leave since. Every time I think about walking out that door, I remember that note. I don't know what it meant. I don't know who left it. But it's the last thing I read before the lights went out. And every night, I hear the creaking again. But now, I don't know if it's the house settling or if it's something waiting. I don't sleep much anymore. It's been weeks since that night, and the cabin feels like a different place now. I keep the lights on, all of them, no matter the time. I've even gotten into the habit of keeping the curtains pulled back during the day, just so I can see outside. But every time I look out the window, all I see is the thick fog, like it's waiting for something to happen. I stop trying to leave. Every time I reach for the door, my chest tightens, and I feel that same pressure from the night I tried to escape. It's like the air becomes heavier, and I can't move. I don't know why I stay, but there's something that keeps pulling me back into this place, as if I'm being held here by something I can't see. And every night, it's the same thing. The sounds, the shadows, the feeling of being watched. At first, I thought I was just being paranoid. Maybe I was too tired, or maybe the isolation was starting to get to me. But the longer I stayed, the more I realized that what happened that night wasn't just my mind playing tricks. It was something real. I heard it again last night. The footsteps. Slow, deliberate, coming from the hallway just like before. I was sitting in the living room trying to read when the house began to creak, just like it had that first night. My heart started to race, but I didn't move. I couldn't. The fear was too much. But then something else happened. Something that felt different. The footsteps stopped, just like that. No more creaking, no more dragging sounds. Only silence. It was then that I realized I wasn't hearing the footsteps in the hallway. I was hearing them inside my own head. A voice, soft but clear, whispered something to me, something I couldn't make out at first. I stood up, my legs unsteady, my breath shallow. The whisper came again, louder this time. It was as if it was coming from right behind me, but when I turned, there was nothing. I tried to ignore it, to focus on the space around me, but the words kept coming. Slowly, I pieced it together. You can't leave. It was a simple message, but it hit me like a cold wave, spreading from my chest to my limbs. I couldn't understand what it meant. The air felt thick, almost suffocating, as if something was pressing in from all sides. I started to panic. My thoughts were racing, trying to make sense of it all. I'd already been hearing strange sounds, seeing things that weren't there. I'd already found the note. But now, it was different. This wasn't just something happening around me anymore. This was something inside me, something that felt too close, too personal. I grabbed my phone, almost desperately, and checked the signal. Still nothing. My fingers were shaking, and I didn't know if I wanted to call someone. or if I was just looking for some kind of proof that I wasn't completely alone in this. That's when I saw it again. The shadow. It wasn't in the hallway this time. It wasn't even outside. It was right in front of me, in the corner of the room, just out of the corner of my eye. I didn't turn to look at it, but I knew it was there. I could feel it. I tried to breathe through the panic, telling myself it was just my mind, that I was imagining things. But the shadow didn't move. It just stayed there. And then I felt it. A weight on my chest, pressing in like something was close enough to touch me. Something was there, watching. I didn't dare turn around. Then the lights went out. Completely. Not even the faint glow from the flashlight on the floor. It was as if everything had been swallowed by darkness. The house became completely still. The silence was thick, suffocating, and I felt it more than ever before. I stood there in the pitch black, my body frozen. My mind was racing, desperate for a way out, but I couldn't think clearly. The whispering came again, softer now, almost like a lullaby. And it was then that I realized something. The voice wasn't just telling me I couldn't leave. It was reminding me that I already hadn't. It was as if the cabin itself had pulled me in. And now I was its prisoner. I've tried to leave again, but the door won't open. I've tried every window. I've even tried to break the lock. But it's like the house is keeping me here, locking me in with whatever it is that's watching me. Sometimes I wonder if it's all in my head. Maybe I've lost it. Maybe the isolation has done something to me. But then I remember the shadow and the whisper and the way the air feels so thick with something I can't explain. I don't know how much longer I can stay here. But every night the feeling gets worse. The whispers grow louder and the shadow, it's always there. And sometimes, in the quiet moments, I hear it again, clearer this time, right behind me like a breath against my ear. You're not leaving. Story 2. I'd moved to the Appalachian Mountains on a whim. Needed to get away from the noise, the crowds, the people. Just wanted to breathe a little, get some peace. The place I rented was an old cabin, tucked away in the woods, far from any neighbors. The kind of place where the trees seemed to reach in through the windows and the air felt thick, like the forest had a life of its own. But it was cheap, quiet, and perfect for what I needed. I spent the first few days settling in, unpacking, enjoying the isolation. But there were things about the cabin that bothered me, things I couldn't ignore. At night, the wind would howl through the trees and the walls would creak. It wasn't just the usual sounds of an old house. It felt personal, like the place was alive, breathing with me. But I tried not to let it get to me. I was in a new place, and the unfamiliar noises were probably just part of the charm. But on the fourth night, something happened. I was sitting by the fireplace, reading a book, when I heard a sound, soft, almost imperceptible at first. Footsteps. Not on the porch, not outside, but inside the cabin. I froze. The footsteps weren't heavy, just slow and deliberate, like someone walking through the hallway outside the room I was in. My heart started to race, but I tried to convince myself it was just the house settling. I had read that cabins, especially old ones, could make all sorts of noises, especially at night. It was probably just the wood expanding with the cold. I forced myself to focus on the fire, but then I heard it again. This time, it was closer. The slow steps, dragging against the wooden floor. There was no breeze, no wind to explain the noise. It was too quiet for it to be the house settling. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I slowly set my book down. I tried to convince myself it was an animal, maybe a raccoon or something in the walls. But then I heard something else, a faint whisper, barely audible, but definitely there. It wasn't clear enough to make out words, but the tone. It felt like someone was speaking directly to me, but there was no one there. I sat completely still, straining to hear. The footsteps had stopped, but that whisper, it lingered. My breathing quickened, and I found myself holding my breath, waiting for the next sound. The cabin felt too quiet now, like it was waiting for something. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity. My heartbeat pounded in my ears, and my mind raced, trying to come up with any logical explanation. Maybe the house had mice. Maybe the wind was blowing through the cracks. But nothing made sense. I stood up slowly, my legs shaky beneath me. I felt the urge to check the hallway to see if anything was there, but I couldn't move. The thought of stepping into that hallway where I had just heard those footsteps terrified me. The room felt smaller, like the walls were closing in. But I had to know. I had to see what was happening. I grabbed the flashlight from the table and walked toward the hallway. As soon as I stepped into the darkness, I could feel the temperature drop, like the air had turned to ice. My breath fogged in front of me. The shadows in the hallway seemed deeper now, and I could swear they moved just slightly. But when I turned the flashlight toward them, there was nothing there. I moved forward, each step echoing louder in the silence. I didn't know why I was going deeper into the house. Part of me wanted to turn and run. But my feet kept moving, as if something was pulling me forward. When I reached the end of the hallway, I saw it. The door to the attic was slightly ajar. I don't know why I hadn't noticed it before, but there it was, standing open like it had been waiting for me. I hadn't opened that door. The air in the hallway was thick, like it was pressing down on me. The attic stairs were narrow and steep, and I could barely see the top of them in the dim light of my flashlight. I stood there for a moment, debating whether to go up. My heart raced and my palms were sweating. Then, without thinking, I moved forward. Each step on the attic stairs creaked loudly, and with each creak, I felt a rush of dread. I could hear my own breath, sharp and shallow, and the pounding of my heart seemed to grow louder with every step I took. I reached the top of the stairs and turned the corner, but there was nothing in the attic. Just boxes, old furniture, and dust. No shadows, no strange sounds. But as I stepped further into the room, I saw something, a chair. It was facing the wall, right in the middle of the floor, like someone had been sitting there. And it was rocking. Not violently, just gently, as if someone had just gotten up. My pulse quickened. I took another step forward, but before I could reach the chair, I heard it again, the whisper. This time, I could make out the words, "You shouldn't have come." The words hung in the air like a weight pressing down on my chest. My breath caught in my throat, and I froze. I didn't move, didn't make a sound. The whisper had been so clear, so direct, like someone was standing right behind me, breathing down my neck. But when I turned, there was nothing. Just the chair, rocking slowly, its back creaking with the faintest motion. I couldn't explain it. I didn't know who had been in the attic or why the chair was moving. But I didn't want to find out. My instincts were screaming at me to leave, to get out of that place. I backed away from the chair, the floorboards groaning beneath my feet, and tried to focus on the stairs. I had to leave. I had to go. But the fear, the tension in the air, made it feel like I couldn't move fast enough. My legs felt heavy, like they were made of stone. Each step felt slower, harder, as if the very space around me was pushing against me, unwilling to let me go. I reached the top of the stairs, and the door to the attic creaked shut, behind me, as if someone had gently nudged it closed. I didn't turn to look. I just kept moving quickly, my heartbeat pounding in my ears. As I stepped back into the hallway, I noticed something else. The hallway light had flickered once, then went completely dark. My flashlight had died earlier, and the sudden darkness felt more suffocating than anything. I wasn't even sure where I was going at this point. Just away from the attic. Away from that feeling. I reached for the nearest light switch, my hand trembling. But when I flicked it, nothing happened. No light, no hum of the bulb turning on. Just the thick, oppressive darkness. The silence in the house was almost unbearable. The only sound was the pounding of my heart and the quiet rustle of my own breath. My mind raced, trying to think of any reason, anything that would explain what was happening. But there was no logical explanation. The whisper, the chair moving on its own, the coldness in the air. None of it made sense. I started moving toward the front door, my feet scraping across the floor in an awkward, hurried shuffle. But when I reached the door, it was locked. I hadn't locked it. I could have sworn I hadn't locked it. My stomach dropped. My fingers shook as I fumbled with the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The door was locked from the inside. My mind raced with panic. I turned and looked down the hallway, as though the answer could be found in the darkened corners. The house felt different now. Empty, but not in a peaceful way. It was as if something had shifted. Something had woken up, and it was watching me. I backed away from the door, my heart pounding harder now, and turned toward the window. I rushed to it, pulling back the curtain, desperate to see the outside world. But the fog was thick, just like before, creeping in so close that I couldn't see more than a few feet beyond the glass. The woods were swallowed by it. It felt like the fog was moving, shifting with a life of its own, like it was trying to pull me back into the forest. That's when I heard it again. Footsteps. Not just the faint echoes from the hallway this time. These were heavy, deliberate steps, moving across the floor of the living room, getting closer. My breath caught in my throat as I froze in place. The footsteps grew louder, clearer, and then stopped, just outside the room. I didn't want to turn around. I couldn't bring myself to look. But I felt it. The presence. Something standing just behind me, close enough to feel its breath on my neck, even though I knew there was no one there. My body went rigid. My thoughts were a blur. A chaotic mess of fear and confusion. Every part of me wanted to turn, to face whatever was behind me, but I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. Then I heard it. A soft, quiet whisper. Again, not from the hallway, but from the air around me. It wasn't clear at first, just a low murmur, like a voice fighting to be heard. "You're still here." The words cut through me like a knife. I turned. Slowly, cautiously. But there was no one there. Nothing. Just the empty hallway behind me. The footsteps had stopped. The air was still. I stumbled backward, the world around me feeling unreal, as though I was no longer in control. The cabin. This place that had once felt so familiar, now felt like a trap. Like the walls themselves were closing in. I didn't know what was happening. I didn't know why it was happening. But I knew one thing for certain. I couldn't stay here. I ran for the back door, praying it wasn't locked, praying I could escape. I reached for the handle, turned it, and it opened. For a moment, I thought I was free. The cool night air rushed in, and I felt a sense of relief, as though I had outrun whatever was chasing me. But just as I stepped outside, something stopped me. The sound of breathing. It was slow, deliberate, deep, coming from behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing there. Only the thick fog swirling around the edges of the house, creeping closer to my feet. I don't know how long I stood there, too afraid to move, too afraid to look back inside, but eventually I ran. I ran as fast as I could down the path, through the woods, with the fog pressing in from every side, I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town. I didn't care where I was going, just that I had to leave, that I had to get away from that place. But even now, I can't forget the feeling of the air pressing down on me, of the footsteps I heard behind me, of the voice whispering in the dark. I don't know what was in that cabin, or if it was just my mind playing tricks. All I know is that something was there, and I don't ever want to go back to find out what it was. I never went back to the cabin, not even once. The memories of that night still haunt me, creeping into my thoughts at the oddest times. The darkness, the feeling of being watched, the whispering voice that I couldn't explain, they all linger. Even now when I close my eyes, I can hear the footsteps, feel the breath on my neck. But here's the thing. Every time I think I'm past it, every time I think I've moved on, something else happens. Small things. Nothing big at first, but enough to make me uneasy. I'll be alone in my apartment, sitting on the couch, and I'll hear the floorboards creak behind me, just like that night. Or I'll wake up in the middle of the night, heart pounding like I'm being watched. It's always there, just under the surface, waiting. The worst part? I've started to notice something. The fog. It's the same fog that hung around the cabin that night. I'll be walking outside on an ordinary day, in the middle of the city, and I'll see it creeping in from nowhere. That thick, suffocating fog that seems to move on its own, that makes the world feel smaller, like the air itself is watching me. At first, I thought I was just remembering things, the panic of that night blurring into my daily life. But then, one evening, just last week, I saw it again. I was sitting by my window looking out at the street when I noticed it. The fog rolling in slowly, swallowing up the buildings across the street. It wasn't like the usual mist we get here in the city. No, this fog, it moved with purpose. It wasn't natural. I tried to ignore it, to brush it off as just a coincidence. But as I watched it, my skin started to crawl. The same feeling from the cabin came rushing back. The same tightness in my chest, the same suffocating pressure. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my jacket and rushed out the door, walking faster than I ever had, trying to escape that eerie feeling that I was being followed. But as I moved through the streets, it followed. That fog. It clung to everything, wrapping around lampposts, creeping into alleyways, moving as though it had a life of its own. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. Then I heard it again, the faintest whisper, almost drowned out by the sound of my own heartbeat. It wasn't clear at first, but then it came again. You can't outrun it. I froze in the middle of the street. My breath caught in my throat, my feet unwilling to move. The voice was so soft, so close, like it was right behind me. I turned, but there was nothing. The street was empty. The fog was thicker now, and I could barely see past a few feet. I started walking again, faster this time, not looking back. I could feel the fog pressing in, hear my own breath sharp in the cold air. And then, in the distance, I saw a shadow. Just the outline of something tall, standing still at the corner of a building. I couldn't make out any details, but I could feel its eyes on me. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I found myself unable to move again. I stood there for what felt like hours, just staring at that shadow, waiting for it to move. But it didn't. Finally, I forced myself to turn away, to keep walking. But the moment I did, I heard the footsteps again. The slow, deliberate steps right behind me. I didn't dare look back. I ran. I ran through the fog, through the streets, without caring where I was going. I didn't stop until I was back in my apartment, slamming the door behind me and locking it. I stood there in the dark for a long time, trying to steady my breathing, trying to calm my racing heart. I don't know what happened that night at the cabin. Maybe it was just a bad dream. Maybe I was just losing my mind. But whatever it was, it's not gone. It's still with me, lurking in the shadows. It followed me here, to the city, and I'm starting to think it always will. I don't know if it's the cabin, the fog, or something else entirely. But every time I close my eyes, I hear those footsteps. Every time I turn around, I feel that weight behind me, pressing in, watching, waiting. And I don't know how much longer I can run. Story 3. I'll never forget that night. It was the last night I stayed in that cabin. I don't know what happened exactly, but I can't shake the feeling that whatever it was waiting for me. I'd been living in the Appalachian Mountains for about a month. The isolation was exactly what I needed at the time. Quiet, peace, and a place to clear my head. The cabin was old, a little run-down, but cozy. It sat alone, surrounded by dense forest. The kind of place that seemed to breathe with the land. The first week was perfect. But after that, I started noticing things. Small things at first. Nothing that would make me second-guess myself. The first incident happened on the third night. I was sitting in the living room reading a book by the fireplace when I heard the floorboards creak. It wasn't the usual sound of a house settling. It was slow, deliberate, like someone was walking just outside the room. I paused, waiting for the sound to come again. Nothing. I shrugged it off as an animal, or maybe just the wind pushing against the walls. But then I heard it again, this time louder. Heavy, almost dragging steps. It wasn't like the house was shifting. It was something else. The air in the room felt heavier, colder, like something was pressing against my chest. I froze. My heart started beating harder, faster. I wanted to get up, to check, but something kept me still. I waited. I don't know for how long, but I kept my eyes fixed on the hallway, trying to peer through the dim light to see if something was there. Nothing moved. Slowly, I got up and made my way to the door frame, peeking around the corner. There was nothing there, just the long stretch of the dark hallway. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe the house was just old, maybe the wind, but that feeling of being watched, it lingered, gnawing at me. I couldn't shake it. Later that night, when I tried to sleep, I could hear it again, the creaking. This time it wasn't footsteps. It was like something was dragging across the floor, slowly, methodically. I couldn't tell where it was coming from. My room was still, but the sound was unmistakable. My heart began to race again. I didn't want to get out of bed, but I couldn't lie there, paralyzed either. I grabbed my flashlight, my hands shaking as I crept out of my room. The hallway was completely dark now, the air even colder. I took a slow, careful step forward, and that's when I heard it. A whisper. Faint, but there. Right behind me. I spun around, but the hallway was empty. My breath quickened, and I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead. I could have sworn someone was right behind me, but when I turned, there was nothing. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, but the whispering stopped as quickly as it started. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't tell if I was just losing my mind from the isolation, or if something else was happening. Maybe it was just the house settling, I told myself again, but deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard the whispers again, the dragging steps in the hallway. And then, something new. A faint thudding sound like something hitting the floor, repeatedly. It was so soft. I thought maybe I was imagining it, but the longer I lay there, the louder it seemed to get. I couldn't stay there any longer. The next morning, I packed my things and went outside, desperate for some fresh air, some clarity. The moment I stepped onto the porch, I felt it. The weight of the air pressing down like I wasn't alone. I don't know how to explain it, but I felt eyes on me, watching from the trees, from the cabin itself. I spent the day in town, away from the cabin, trying to push the feeling aside. But when I returned later that evening, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The door was ajar. I had locked it when I left. There was no way it should have been open. I didn't go inside. I didn't need to. I knew it was time to leave. And yet, as I turned to walk away, I heard it again. The creaking, the whispering. It was coming from inside the cabin, coming closer. I didn't look back. I didn't look back. I kept walking, my heart pounding in my chest, but something in me knew that if I stopped, if I turned around, I wouldn't be able to leave. It wasn't just fear anymore. It was something else. Something that had wrapped itself around me since I first stepped foot in that cabin. I didn't stop until I reached my car. I threw my things into the back seat, my hands shaking, my mind racing. I kept telling myself it was nothing, that I was just spooked. The woods, the isolation, the creaking cabin, it all added up to paranoia. But the whispers, the dragging sound, and that feeling of being watched, they didn't feel like the product of my imagination. I started the engine and drove away, glancing in the rearview mirror. The cabin was still there, sitting in the dark, shrouded by the trees. The porch light was on. I hadn't left it on. But I didn't look back long. I couldn't. The drive out of the mountains felt long, endless, like the road was winding back on itself. The further I got from the cabin, the more the tension in my chest began to ease. The air felt lighter, the silence around me less suffocating. I tried to shake off the last lingering bits of fear, but it clung to me, like a chill I couldn't get rid of. When I finally reached the nearest town, I checked into a small motel. I told myself I'd sleep, get some rest, and then leave everything behind. But I couldn't sleep. The whispering kept creeping into my mind. Each time I closed my eyes, I heard that dragging sound, the faintest rustling of something moving in the dark. It wasn't a memory of the cabin anymore. It was as if it was happening all over again. Around 3 a.m., I heard it. A breath. A faint exhale of air, like someone was standing right beside me. I bolted upright in bed, my heart racing. But the room was still. Empty. The only sound was my own shallow breathing. But that was when I realized the air had gotten colder. Much colder in the room. The window was closed and the heater had been running all night. But I felt it, the chill pressing against my skin. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Not even here. Not in the safety of the motel room. I grabbed my phone to check the time. Anything to distract me, but when I unlocked it, the screen flashed briefly, and then something strange appeared. A message. It wasn't from anyone I knew. It wasn't even a phone number. Just a string of random letters and then a single word at the bottom. Come back. I stared at the screen, my hands frozen around the phone. The blood drained from my face and the room seemed to close in on me. I wanted to throw the phone down, but I couldn't. I couldn't stop staring at the message. I didn't know how it got there, but it didn't feel like a coincidence. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. In the morning, I packed my things quickly, and without a second thought, I checked out of the motel. I didn't want to stick around to find out what else might happen. I wanted to forget everything, the cabin, the whispers, the message. But as I drove away, something caught my eye in the rearview mirror again. It wasn't the cabin this time. It was the woods, the trees, thick and dark, almost like they were moving, swaying in a way that felt wrong. And then, just for a second, I thought I saw something in the distance, a figure standing between the trees watching me. But when I looked again, it was gone. The rest of the drive back to the city was uneventful, but I couldn't shake the feeling. It stayed with me, sitting heavy on my chest like a weight I couldn't escape. I kept telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks, but deep down, I knew it wasn't over. I don't know what it was in that cabin. I don't know who or what left me the message. But I'm sure of one thing. Whatever it was, it's still out there, waiting. And I don't think it will ever let me go. Story 4. I'd rented the cabin for a weekend getaway. Just wanted some time alone, away from everything. The cabin was tucked deep in the woods, far from any neighbors. I liked the idea of being completely off the grid, disconnected. First few hours felt peaceful, but there was something about the cabin itself that unsettled me. Old wood, cracked windows, and the constant sound of the wind whispering through the trees. It was quiet, in a way that was almost too quiet, if that makes sense. The kind of silence that presses in on you. I tried not to let it get to me. I made some tea, sat by the fire, and read for a while. But then, just as the sun started to set, I heard it. The first sound that made me freeze. It was soft at first, just a creak, like the floorboards shifting. I'd been hearing the house settle all afternoon, but this was different. The creaking was rhythmic, like someone was walking around upstairs. I stood up slowly, my heart starting to beat faster. There was no one else in the cabin. I checked the door when I arrived, locked it behind me. No one should have been there. The footsteps, or whatever they were, grew louder, each one more distinct than the last. They moved in a slow, deliberate pattern, as if someone was pacing around up there. I froze, my breath caught in my throat, and I waited, trying to convince myself it was just the wind again. But then it stopped, completely. I stood there, straining to hear anything, but it was dead quiet. My heartbeat was the only sound. My mind raced, trying to figure out what was happening. I told myself I was being paranoid, that it was probably just the house. Old houses do that, right? They settle, they groan, they make noises. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I moved toward the stairs, my steps hesitant, my hand gripping the railing. The air in the cabin had turned cold, and as I made my way up to the second floor, I could feel the weight of it, the stillness. When I reached the top of the stairs, I looked around. The hallway was empty. There was no one there, but the air was different. It felt thick, suffocating, like I was standing in a place I didn't belong. My skin prickled, and I suddenly felt very small in that hallway. My mind told me to turn around, to leave, but my feet wouldn't move. Then I heard it again. This time it wasn't footsteps. It was a whisper. So faint, I almost thought I imagined it, but it was there, clear as day. Go, it said. Just that one word. I spun around, my heart slamming in my chest, but there was no one there. The hallway was still. But the whispering lingered like a shadow in the back of my mind. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I wanted to run, but my legs felt heavy, like they were made of stone. I turned back to the stairs, but before I could take a step, I heard something else. A soft breath. Close, too close. My head whipped around, my eyes darting through the dim hallway, but there was no one. No one except me and the oppressive silence. I couldn't take it anymore. I ran downstairs, not even bothering to look behind me. The feeling of being watched was too much. I grabbed my things, shoved them into my bag, and rushed for the door. But when I reached it, it wouldn't open. I yanked at the handle, but it was stuck, like something was keeping it shut from the other side. My breath came in short, sharp gasps. I turned, looking for another way out, but every window was locked, every door sealed shut. The weight of the cabin, the heaviness in the air, seemed to press in on me. That's when I heard it, again. The whisper. Louder this time, almost like a scream. You're not leaving. I felt my throat tighten. My pulse raced as the words echoed in my head. You're not leaving. I spun around, my eyes desperately searching the room for any sign of movement. The walls seemed to close in on me, the air thick and suffocating. I tried the door again, my hands trembling, but it wouldn't budge. I pulled harder, but no matter how much force I used, the handle stayed still, almost mocking me. My breathing came faster, shallow. I had to get out. I had to get away. But the more I pulled at the door, the more my mind raced, swirling with questions that didn't have answers. What was happening? What was in this place? Suddenly, the temperature dropped. I could see my breath misting in front of me. The chill was bone deep, like the air itself was alive, watching me. I stepped back, my feet dragging along the floor. I didn't know where to go. The whole cabin felt like a trap, the walls closing in, suffocating me from all sides. I heard it again, the faintest shuffle of footsteps. This time, though, they weren't coming from upstairs. No, they were coming from the other side of the room, from the dark corner by the fireplace. I couldn't see anything there, but the sound was unmistakable. The heavy drag of something moving, slow and deliberate, as if it was circling me. I didn't dare take my eyes off that corner, but my instincts were screaming at me to move, to do something, anything. But my feet stayed glued to the floor. I could feel the cold creeping up my spine, the weight of the presence in the room growing heavier, more suffocating with each passing second. And then, from that dark corner, I heard it again. A voice, soft, too soft to understand at first. But as I leaned in, my breath catching in my throat, the words came through, clear as day. You shouldn't have come here. My heart stopped. The voice wasn't a whisper this time. It was a full, chilling sentence, and I knew without a doubt that I wasn't alone in that room. I wasn't imagining it. I wasn't just hearing things. I turned toward the corner, my hands shaking uncontrollably as I took a step closer. The shadows were deep, swallowing the light from the fireplace. But nothing moved, nothing shifted. I was alone in the room, or at least I thought I was. That's when I felt it. A pressure on my chest, like someone was standing just behind me, breathing softly into my ear. The air was so cold I could feel it on the back of my neck, the hairs standing on end. I couldn't stand it any longer. I turned and bolted for the door again, pulling, yanking at the handle with everything I had. But it still wouldn't open. I could feel the panic rising, the sweat on my skin turning cold. I was trapped. Trapped in a place where something knew me, knew what I was thinking, knew what I feared. I turned toward the windows, but they were just as useless. I pulled at the curtain, looking out, but the fog was so thick I couldn't see anything beyond the glass. It was like the whole world had disappeared, leaving just me and the suffocating cabin. Then I heard something else. It wasn't footsteps, and it wasn't a voice. It was a soft, wet sound, like something dragging across the floor, something with weight to it. It moved closer, inching across the room toward me. I felt my legs give out, my knees hitting the floor with a soft thud. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. The only thing I could do was stare at the corner, where the darkness seemed to pulse, the shadows deeper than anything I'd ever seen. And then it stopped, all of it. The footsteps, the breathing, the dragging sound. For a moment, I thought it was over, that whatever had been in the cabin had finally left. But when I turned to look at the door again, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The handle was turning. It wasn't turning on its own. I didn't do it. It was moving slowly, as if something was on the other side, testing the door. I couldn't take it anymore. With every ounce of strength I had, I ran. I ran past the windows, past the shadows, past the cold, and I didn't stop until I was outside, standing in the middle of the fog, gasping for air. I don't know how I managed to get away. I don't know how I made it back to my car, but when I did, I drove as fast as I could, I didn't look back. I didn't want to. I don't know what was in that cabin. I don't know what it wanted or why it followed me, but I know one thing. I will never go back. The worst part, even now sometimes when I close my eyes, I can hear the whispering and the footsteps and the cold breath on the back of my neck. I don't think it's ever really gone. Story 5. I was driving alone through the Appalachian Mountains late one night, cutting through a narrow road that barely had any streetlights. I had been on the road for hours, the kind of silence where even the hum of the car starts to sound like a heartbeat. My GPS lost signal about 20 minutes earlier, and I hadn't seen another car since. I was somewhere between North Carolina and Tennessee. At least that's what the last road sign said before the trees swallowed everything around me. The forest there is dense. It's like the dark grows thicker between the trunks, and your headlights never really cut through it. I wasn't scared at first. I'd driven through rural back roads plenty of times, but something about that stretch made me uneasy. Maybe it was how the air felt heavy, like the humidity wasn't just weather. It was watching me. I started noticing strange things after I passed a wooden bridge. First, there was the smell. It wasn't rot exactly, more like wet soil and something faintly metallic. Then I saw it. A cabin just off the road, barely visible through the trees. The light from my high beams caught its front window for a second. There was someone standing inside, facing out. I slowed down instinctively, squinting through the windshield, but the figure didn't move. No flashlight, no lantern glow, just that faint outline behind the glass. Then my headlights flickered. Just once, but enough to make my stomach tighten. When the light steadied again, the window was empty. I pressed the gas and kept driving. A few miles later, I realized I had circled back. The same crooked wooden bridge appeared in front of me, and the same cabin stood beyond the trees. My pulse started to race. I knew I hadn't turned around, but somehow I was back where I started. The smell was stronger this time. Wet earth and iron, like something freshly dug up. I stopped the car. The dashboard clock said 2:47 a.m., though it had been 2:47 when I checked it the last time, too. I remember that clearly because I stared at it for nearly a minute, waiting for it to change. It didn't. I thought about turning around, but there was nowhere else to go. The forest pressed in on both sides, and the narrow road ahead looked like it just stopped. My hands were shaking so badly I had to keep both on the wheel. That's when I noticed something moving near the tree line. It wasn't fast. Just slow, deliberate steps between the trees, keeping distance, but definitely watching me. My first thought was that it might be a person who lived up here. Maybe a hunter or someone from the cabin. But when my headlights swept across the spot again, there was no one there. Only the outline of footprints leading away from the road, disappearing into the undergrowth. I don't know why I got out of the car. Maybe it was the weird sense that I was supposed to. Like something quiet but persistent was calling me closer. The night air hit me cold and damp. I could hear nothing but the faint buzz of insects and the slow rhythm of my breathing. The cabin was barely 50 feet away. I walked toward it, crunching through the gravel and leaves, each step sounding way too loud in the silence. The closer I got, the more I noticed the windows weren't broken, but covered from the inside with something dark. Then I saw the door. It was open, just a few inches, enough for me to see that the interior wasn't completely dark. Something inside was glowing faintly. I should have left right then, but instead, I took one more step forward. The glow inside wasn't from a lamp or a fire. It was too pale, almost like moonlight, but coming from deep within the cabin. I stood in the doorway, trying to make sense of it. The air smelled like damp wood and something old. like the inside of a long-forgotten basement. My voice came out quieter than I expected. Hello? No answer. Just the sound of my own breathing. The floor creaked under my boots as I stepped inside. The walls were covered in faded newspaper clippings, yellowed and curling at the edges. Some were dated from decades ago, missing persons, old local tragedies, forest fires. The pictures were blurred, but one of them caught my eye. It was of a man standing in front of what looked like this exact cabin. His face had been scratched out with something sharp. That faint light was coming from the back room. I could see it spilling through a half-open door. I moved closer, slow and quiet, my heartbeat loud in my chest. I remember thinking how absurd it was, how this felt like something out of a movie, but the weight of the air told me it was real. When I pushed the back door open, the smell hit me first. Earth, iron, and something sour beneath it. The room was almost empty except for a wooden table in the center. On it sat an oil lamp that wasn't lit, but still giving off that strange light. It shimmered softly, like it wasn't really there. Beside the lamp were several old photographs. Most were too faded to make out, but one was recent. My breath caught when I realized what I was looking at. It was my car. Same dent on the front bumper, same sticker on the back window. The photo had been taken that night. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over the uneven floorboards. The lamp flickered, and for a moment the whole room shifted, like everything tilted slightly sideways. I swear I felt the ground move under my feet. Then I heard something. Not a noise, not a voice, just a shift in the air behind me, like someone had stepped into the doorway. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. My whole body froze, every instinct screaming to get out. I forced myself to move, one step, then another, until I was outside again. The night air felt different, colder, sharper. The trees seemed closer now, the forest darker than before. When I looked back, the cabin was gone. There was only the empty clearing, silent and untouched. I ran to my car, fumbling, with the keys, slamming the door shut as soon as I got in. My headlights flicked on, but the road ahead wasn't the same one I'd come from. It looked wrong, like the curves were sharper, the trees leaning in too close. Still, I drove. I don't remember how long. Could have been 10 minutes or an hour. The clock still said 2:47. My hands were trembling so hard that I could barely keep the wheels straight. And then, just as suddenly as it started, the road opened up. I saw the lights of a small gas station ahead. Bright, normal, almost too bright. I pulled in, barely able to breathe. There was a man sweeping near the door who looked at me like I'd crawled out of a storm. "You okay, son?" he asked. I wanted to tell him everything, the cabin, the photo, the road. But when I turned around to point back the way I came, there was nothing but open highway. I sat there at the gas station for what felt like hours, just gripping the steering wheel, trying to stop shaking. The man inside must have noticed, because after a while he came out and handed me a cup of coffee. It was warm, grounding. The first real thing that felt normal again. He asked where I'd come from. I told him I wasn't sure anymore. I said I'd gotten lost on a mountain road, near a wooden bridge in an old cabin. When I said that, his expression changed. Not confusion, recognition, like he'd heard it before. "There hasn't been a bridge up there in years," he said slowly. "Flood took it out back in the 80s. I wanted to argue, to tell him I'd driven across it less than an hour ago, but the look in his eyes stopped me. He wasn't joking. I could tell he believed what he was saying. I stayed there until sunrise, too afraid to get back on the road. When daylight finally came, I asked for directions and tried to retrace my path, just to prove to myself that I hadn't imagined it. I drove north for a while, then east, back toward the mountains. The GPS worked again, but the map didn't show any turns matching where I'd been. No bridge, no side road, no sign of a cabin. Just an unbroken stretch of highway and trees. Still, I kept driving. I don't know what I was hoping for. Maybe to see something familiar, or maybe to see nothing at all. Eventually, I found a small dirt trail branching off from the main road. The entrance looked half overgrown, but the shape of it felt right, like the road I remembered. I followed it a short way until it ended at a clearing. There was no cabin, only a patch of dead grass and the faint outline of something that might have once been a foundation. A few pieces of old wood stuck up through the dirt, blackened with age. I got out and walked around slowly. The air was quiet, too still for that time of day. I almost turned back to my car when I saw it, half buried in the soil at the edge of the clearing. A photograph. It was damp and faded, but I could still make it out. My car again. Same angle. Only, this time, there was someone standing behind it. I looked closer. The figure was tall, thin, wearing something dark. The face was turned toward the camera, but the details were blurred, like the photo had melted at that spot. My stomach twisted as I realized where the picture had been taken, right there, in that same clearing. I dropped it and backed away. My chest felt tight, and for a moment the air seemed heavier again, just like that night. I don't know if it was panic or something else, but I swear the light around me dimmed, even though it was midday. I got in my car and left without looking back. I've never gone near those mountains since. Sometimes late at night, I think about that frozen clock, 2:47 a.m., and the photo that shouldn't have existed. A few weeks after, I noticed dirt under my back bumper, packed deep into the creases of the metal. It hadn't rained. I hadn't driven off-road since that night. I cleaned it off once. The next morning, it was there again, and I don't drive at night anymore. Story 6. I was hiking alone through a section of the Appalachian Trail in western Virginia. I'd done solo hikes before, but this one felt different from the start. The air was colder than usual for early autumn, and the fog never seemed to lift. It wasn't thick enough to stop me from seeing the path, but it hung there, just dense enough to blur everything past a few dozen feet. I had planned to camp near an old ranger outpost I'd read about online, just an abandoned wooden cabin deep in the woods that hikers sometimes used as shelter. Locals said it had been empty for decades, but they also said it was sturdy and dry. That's all I cared about. By late afternoon, I reached it. The cabin looked exactly like the photos. Weathered wood, sagging roof, and a small porch that creaked under my boots. The forest around it was dead quiet, not even the sound of birds. I figured that was normal. It was late in the season. But still, the silence bothered me. Inside, the air smelled old, like dust and rain-soaked timber. My flashlight beam caught a few empty shelves, a broken chair, and what looked like claw marks along the inside of the doorframe. Probably animals, I told myself. Bears or raccoons. Nothing strange. I set up my sleeping bag in the corner, ate a quick meal, and tried to relax. The sun dipped fast, leaving only that dim gray light that always seems to linger in the mountains. I remember lying there, listening to the wind moving through the trees outside and feeling the stillness press against the walls. That's when I heard footsteps outside. They were slow, measured, crunching through the leaves, one after another. My stomach tightened. I told myself it was just another hiker passing by, but the steps didn't continue down the trail. They stopped right outside the cabin. I held my breath and waited. After a few seconds, I heard the porch creak. Then silence again. I turned off my flashlight and sat perfectly still in the dark, heart pounding so hard it made my chest ache. Whoever, or whatever, was out there didn't move for what felt like minutes. Finally, I whispered to myself, It's just an animal, though even I didn't believe it. Then the sound of breathing came through the walls. Not loud, just faint, steady, like someone standing on the other side of the door. I didn't move. I couldn't. After a while, the sound faded. I sat there in the dark until exhaustion finally forced me to lie down again. I must have fallen asleep at some point because when I opened my eyes, the light coming through the cracks in the walls was blue and pale. Morning. I felt a rush of relief. Maybe I'd imagined it all. Maybe the wind or the echo of my own movements had tricked me. Then I saw the footprints in the dirt just outside the doorway. Bare feet, long, uneven impressions. And they weren't leading to the cabin. They were leading away. I stared at those footprints for a long time. The morning air was cold, enough to sting my skin, but the tracks were clear, fresh, pressed deep into the damp soil. Whoever had made them must have been there only hours before. The prints went straight into the trees, following no clear path, just vanishing into the fog. Part of me wanted to pack up and leave right then, but curiosity got the better of me. I followed them for a few yards, careful not to step on them. The pattern was strange. Some prints were deep, others barely visible, like the person had been limping or dragging one leg. Then they stopped. No fade, no turn. Just ended in the middle of a patch of moss. The forest was silent again. No birds, no insects, not even wind. That kind of silence you can feel pressing on your ears. I turned around and headed back toward the cabin, but something about the trees felt different. They seemed closer together, taller, casting shadows that didn't match the direction of the sun. When I reached the clearing, my stomach dropped. My backpack, which I'd left leaning against the porch, was gone. My sleeping bag was still there, half unrolled, but the bag itself vanished. I scanned the ground for more footprints, but there were none. Just mine, leading back from the trees. I walked around the cabin, checked behind the logs, even climbed the short slope near the back. Nothing. I went inside again, trying to think clearly. My heart was pounding so fast it felt like I couldn't catch my breath. I told myself it was a bear, or maybe someone hiking who thought the bag was abandoned. But that didn't explain the footprints. That didn't explain what happened next. As I was gathering my things to leave, I noticed something carved into the inside of the door. I hadn't seen it the night before. It was faint, like it had been scraped there a long time ago. It was a single word: stay. My chest tightened. I backed away from the door and almost tripped over my gear. The fog outside had thickened, swallowing the clearing until I could barely see the tree line. My hands were shaking so bad I could hardly zip my bag. Still, I forced myself to start walking. I didn't care where the trail led. I just needed to get down the mountain before the sun set again. After about an hour, I realized the path wasn't where it should have been. The landmarks didn't match the map. Every turn led to more trees, more fog. The forest felt endless, repeating itself. At one point, I stopped to rest against a rock. That's when I noticed it, the faint outline of a cabin through the mist, just a few hundred feet ahead. It looked exactly like the one I'd left. I froze. My first thought was that I'd somehow looped back by accident. But when I stepped closer, my heart nearly stopped. The door was open, and hanging on one of the porch beams was my missing backpack. I stood there for a long time, staring at that backpack. The same one I'd lost hours ago. The same tear near the zipper. It was just swaying slightly, like it had been hung there carefully. Everything inside me told me not to go closer, but I couldn't walk away. My legs felt weak, my breathing shallow. I stepped onto the porch, each board groaning under my weight. The air around the cabin felt colder than the rest of the forest, like the temperature dropped the closer I got. The door was still open, just a few inches. I could see inside. Everything looked exactly as I'd left it. My sleeping bag in the corner, my footprints in the dust. Only one thing was different. There was something new carved into the wall, next to the word stay. A second word, faint but clear enough to read, you. My vision blurred for a second, and a rush of panic hit me so strong it almost made me dizzy. I grabbed my backpack, not caring if anyone or anything was nearby. I didn't check what was inside. I just wanted to be gone. I ran. I didn't even bother finding the trail. I moved downhill, pushing through branches and roots, tearing my clothes on thorns. Every step felt like the forest was shifting around me, the trees twisting closer. The fog followed, thick and heavy, until I could barely see my hands in front of me. Then, suddenly, the ground opened up to a road, a paved road. I stumbled onto it, gasping for air, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my head. A few minutes later, a pickup truck appeared in the distance. I waved it down, desperate, trying to explain what happened. The man driving looked at me like I was in shock. He told me there hadn't been a cabin up that trail for more than 30 years. Said it burned down after some hiker went missing back in the 90s. He even pointed out the hill where it used to stand. But when I looked, there was nothing but a few blackened stones and overgrown weeds. I didn't argue. I just thanked him for the ride and stared out the window the whole way back to town. That night, in the motel, I finally checked my backpack. Everything was inside exactly as I'd packed it, except for one thing. Tucked into the side pocket was a photograph. It showed the cabin. Same angle I'd first seen it from the trail. Only this time, there was someone standing in the doorway. It wasn't me. The figure was taller, thinner, its head slightly tilted, facing the camera. I still have that photo. I've shown it to people, and they all say the same thing. It's probably an old image stuck in the bag from a past owner. But I know it wasn't there before. Sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can still see that fog, that clearing, that open door. And I can still hear the faint sound of breathing, like it's right behind me, waiting for me to go back. Story 7. This happened 5 years ago, somewhere deep in the Appalachian Mountains of West Virginia. I was working as a surveyor for a small environmental firm. Most of my job involved hiking through backwoods areas, measuring land, checking soil samples. Nothing exciting. But that trip still keeps me up some nights. Our assignment was to document forest erosion along a section of land that had been untouched for decades. It wasn't on any main trail, just a faded access road that disappeared into the woods. My partner, Tom, was supposed to join me, but he came down with the flu the day before. I figured I could handle it alone. I'd done solo field work plenty of times. I remember how still the forest was that morning. No wind, no insects, just the crunch of my boots and the hum of my equipment bag. I followed an old logging path until it split near a dried creek bed. The map showed an abandoned cabin a mile east, probably from the old mining days. I decided to check it out, thinking it might make a good rest stop. When I found it, the place looked ancient. The roof sagged, and the walls were nearly swallowed by vines. Still, it was standing. The air smelled damp, like rot and cold stone. Inside, the light from my headlamp hit dust swirling in the air like ash. There were pieces of furniture still there, a table, a chair, a rusted lantern on the floor. The strangest thing was a pile of stones in the corner, perfectly stacked about waist high. It looked deliberate, like a marker or a memorial. I remember brushing my hand along the wall and feeling grooves cut into the wood, marks that almost looked like tally lines. Dozens of them, uneven and carved deep. I spent maybe 20 minutes inside, writing notes and taking a few photos. I didn't see anything unusual, just that strange stone pile. But when I stepped outside, the forest didn't look right. The light had changed. Darker somehow, even though it was only early afternoon. The air felt heavier, too, like the pressure before a storm. I decided to pack up early and start heading back, but after about 10 minutes on the trail, I realized I couldn't hear the stream anymore. I should have been able to. Its sound carried for miles, but there was nothing. Just silence. Then I heard something moving behind me. Not an animal, not the sound of branches breaking or leaves rustling. It was slower, steadier, like someone pacing through the undergrowth, matching my steps. I turned around, shining my light through the trees, but there was no one. I told myself it was my imagination. Long days in the woods can do that to you. But the longer I stood there, the clearer it became that I wasn't alone. The air felt charged, like static on my skin. That's when I noticed something through the trees, just ahead of me. A faint light. It was flickering, pale and constant, almost like a lantern swinging gently in the distance. I remember whispering to myself, "Someone's out here." I thought maybe another hiker, maybe an old trapper's camp. I started toward it, cautiously. The path dipped low and curved around a line of fallen trees. Every step felt heavier, like the ground wanted to pull me in. The light didn't move. When I reached the clearing, my stomach dropped. It wasn't a campfire or a lantern. It was that same cabin. The same warped walls, the same slanted roof. I'd walked straight back to it without realizing. Only this time, the door was open. I froze when I saw the door open. I knew I'd shut it before leaving. I stood there for a moment, trying to convince myself maybe it hadn't latched. Maybe the wind pushed it open. But there was no wind. The air was perfectly still. My pulse was loud in my ears as I stepped closer. The interior looked darker than before, even with daylight behind me. The stone pile was still there in the corner, but now it looked different, taller, as if more had been added since I'd left. I ran my light across the room, my throat dry, heart thudding hard enough that it felt painful. The tally marks on the wall caught my eye again. I'd counted roughly 30 before. Now there were more. Dozens more. I couldn't move for a second. It was like my body refused to react. I told myself I must have miscounted earlier, but part of me knew that wasn't true. I felt it in my chest, a slow wave of dread that settled deep, like something heavy pressing down on me from above. I wanted to leave right then, but when I turned toward the doorway, I saw something on the floor near the threshold. My equipment bag, the one I'd been carrying. I hadn't dropped it. I was sure of that. It was zipped shut, sitting neatly against the door frame like someone had placed it there. I reached down slowly and picked it up. Everything inside was where it should have been, except my camera. I felt cold all over when I realized it was gone. I checked my pockets, my jacket, every corner of the cabin. Nothing. My light caught something on the table, though, a small object glinting faintly in the dust. It was the lens cover from my camera. It hadn't been there before. That was enough. I walked out, forcing myself not to look back. I could feel that same heavy silence following me again, the same awareness that something unseen was just beyond the tree line. Every few minutes I turned around to check, but the forest stayed still. After maybe an hour of hiking, I finally saw sunlight breaking through the fog. Relief washed over me until I noticed the smell. Damp, earthy, faintly metallic. It was the same smell that clung to the inside of that cabin. Then, through the thinning trees, I saw it again. The cabin. I just stood there staring, my legs refusing to move. The clearing looked exactly the same. Same shape, same collapsed fence, even the same shadows across the ground. But something felt off. The doorway was darker than before, and this time I could see something faintly glowing inside. It wasn't fire. It was cold. Bluish light, like the reflection off metal. I didn't go closer. My chest was tight, and my breathing came out uneven. I turned and started walking in the opposite direction. Faster this time, not caring about the path or the compass. My hands were shaking so badly I nearly dropped my pack. I kept moving, trying to focus on the sound of my boots hitting the soil. Anything to drown out that growing sense that I wasn't walking alone. At one point, I thought I heard breathing behind me. Steady, controlled, just out of sync with mine. I didn't turn around. I just kept walking until my legs burned and my lungs ached. When I finally broke through the trees again, I saw a wooden sign ahead, weathered, half collapsed. It said, "Old Miner's Cabin. Trail closed." I turned to look behind me. The forest was empty, but when I looked down, there was a single footprint beside mine. Bare, long, and sunk deep into the mud. I stared at that footprint until my vision blurred. It wasn't from boots or shoes, it was human. Barefoot. The impression was deep enough that I could see the shape of the toes, pressed firmly into the soil as if whoever made it had been standing there a long time, watching. My first thought was that maybe it was old, left by someone else, but it wasn't. The edges were clean, wet and fresh. It couldn't have been more than a few minutes old. I forced myself to keep moving. The trail marker pointed downhill, so I followed it. The air grew colder, and the forest seemed to close in tighter the farther I went. My legs were trembling, every step slower than the last. I remember checking my watch, only to see the screen frozen on the same time it had shown hours ago. 1:16 p.m. I smacked it against my wrist, but the display didn't change. The woods felt endless. Every few hundred feet, I'd glance over my shoulder, certain I'd see someone, something following. But there was never anything there, only the faint echo of my breathing bouncing off the trees. I don't know how long I walked before I found the clearing. It was wide, open, and the light felt wrong. Too dim, like dusk even though the sky above was bright. At the center of the clearing was something half buried in the dirt. I moved closer before I realized what it was. My camera. It was lying on its side, lens cracked, mud splattered across the viewfinder. I picked it up carefully and hit the playback button. Somehow, the battery still had charge. There were only 3 photos stored. The first was of the cabin interior, the stone pile taken from the corner. The second was the same cabin, but the photo looked warped, stretched, like the walls had curved inward. The third made my stomach twist. It was a picture of me, standing outside the cabin, taken from just a few feet away. I dropped the camera and backed away, heart hammering so hard I felt dizzy. I wanted to scream, but couldn't get any sound. Out. The trees around me felt closer, leaning in. Every instinct told me to run, so I did, downhill through brush and mud, until I finally saw the faint outline of a road below. When I reached it, I collapsed against the gravel shoulder, gasping for air. A few minutes later, an old pickup came around the bend. The driver slowed when he saw me, rolled down his window, and asked if I was all right. I told him I'd gotten lost hiking near an old miner's cabin. He frowned. "Ain't been a cabin up that way in years," he said. "They tore it down after someone disappeared out there." I didn't respond. I just stared at the forest behind me, half expecting to see that flickering light again. But there was nothing, just still trees and quiet air. The man gave me a ride back to town. I didn't tell him about the footprint or the photos. I didn't tell anyone. Later that night, at home, I plugged the camera into my laptop. There were only 2 images now. The one of the stone pile was gone. In its place was a new photo. The same clearing. Empty. Except for a fresh pile of stones. Taller than before. And something sticking out of the top. My broken headlamp. I deleted the file. But sometimes I still dream about that place. I'll see that soft light through the trees. Hear my own uneven breathing. And wake up with dirt under my nails. I've never gone back to the Appalachians. But some nights, when everything's quiet, I can still feel that weight in the air, like something out there remembers me. Story 8. This happened a few years ago, and I still don't have an explanation for it. I'd been hiking alone through a stretch of the Appalachian Mountains in western North Carolina. It wasn't anything extreme, just a 2-day trip with my camera, some food, and a small tent. I've always liked the solitude out there. There's something peaceful about the air in those mountains. The silence feels thicker, heavier. The first day went fine. I made good progress, took some photos of the ridgeline, and reached an open clearing by evening. My plan was to camp there overnight before heading back down in the morning. I set up my tent, cooked some soup, and watched the sun go down behind the tree line. It was quiet except for the wind brushing through the leaves. I remember lying in my sleeping bag that night, staring up at the tent ceiling. I wasn't tired yet, so I just listened to the soft rustle of the forest, the faint creaking of trees shifting. It was the kind of silence that makes you aware of your own breathing. I felt small, but calm. At some point, I must have drifted off because I woke up later to my tent being brighter than it should have been. I sat up, blinking, thinking it was the moonlight, but when I unzipped the flap, I realized it wasn't. There was a dim orange glow coming from somewhere deeper in the woods, like firelight. I thought maybe it was another camper. I didn't see any other cars at the trailhead, but maybe someone had come in from another direction. I hesitated, then grabbed my flashlight and stepped out. The air was colder than before, and my breath came out in small white clouds. The glow was steady, not flickering like a campfire should. I started toward it, moving slow. The ground was uneven, covered in dry leaves that crunched under my boots. Every few steps, I'd stop and listen. I thought I heard something faint. A shuffle, maybe? But it could have been anything. When I finally reached the source of the light, I realized it wasn't a fire at all. It was coming from an old cabin. It looked like it had been there for decades. Half sunk into the ground, roof sagging, windows boarded. The light came through a gap in the wood slats, steady and low. I don't know why, but something about it didn't feel right. My stomach tightened. I told myself to turn around, go back to my tent, forget it. But curiosity won. I walked closer, the air getting colder with every step. My flashlight beam trembled across the walls, catching on the old wood and the dark space beneath the porch. I reached the door. It was half open, hanging crooked. Inside, I could see the light source now. It was an old lantern sitting on a table, still burning. There was no one inside, just the faint smell of smoke and something metallic. I should have left right then, but I didn't. Instead, I stepped in and called out softly, asking if anyone was there. No answer. Just that heavy quiet pressing against my ears. I took another step forward, my boots creaking on the warped floor. That's when I noticed something strange near the corner. A pile of stones, stacked carefully, about knee-high. They looked too deliberate, like someone had built them for a reason. That's when the floorboards behind me shifted. I froze. It wasn't loud, but it was close, like weight settling. slow and cautious. I turned my light toward the doorway. There was no one there, but I could feel it. Someone was near me, watching. My heartbeat started to race. I told myself to leave, but my legs didn't move. And then, just barely, I heard breathing, low, uneven, somewhere behind the stone pile. I stumbled back, almost tripping over the floorboard, and ran out of that cabin without looking back. I didn't stop until I saw the glow of my own tent through the trees. When I got there, the lantern light behind me went out. Everything went black. I didn't sleep after that. I sat inside my tent with my flashlight on, clutching my pocket knife and listening to every sound outside. The woods felt different now, like the air had thickened, heavy with something unseen. I kept telling myself it was just my imagination, that maybe an animal had wandered into that cabin. But no animal breathes like that. The hours crawled by. Every now and then I'd hear the wind slide through the trees, or a faint creak from a branch somewhere in the darks. My mind began to play tricks on me. I started thinking I could hear slow footsteps circling my camp, faint and dragging, crunching over leaves and then fading again. I wanted to unzip the tent and check, but I couldn't bring myself to move. My heart was pounding so hard it hurt. At some point, I realized my flashlight was dying. The beam dimmed until it was just a soft circle of light on the floor of my tent. I sat there in the half-dark, breathing shallow and fast, waiting for morning. When the first gray light of dawn came through the trees, I finally stepped outside. Everything looked normal again. The forest was quiet. The air smelled like wet soil, and the ground was covered in dew. For a moment, I felt stupid for being so scared. I packed my things quickly and started down the trail. The sooner I got back to my car, the better. But as I walked, I kept glancing over my shoulder. The woods were too still. No birds, no rustle of movement. Just silence that followed me like a shadow. About a mile down, I noticed something strange on the side of the trail. A small stack of stones, the same size and shape as the one I'd seen in that cabin. I stopped and stared at it, trying to convince myself it was just a coincidence. People build cairns all the time, right? Hikers mark paths with them. Still, my stomach turned. I stepped around it carefully and kept walking, trying not to look back. Another mile later, I found another stack. This one was right in the middle of the trail. That's when I started to panic. I picked up my pace, heart thudding, eyes darting through the trees on either side. I didn't want to run, not yet, but my legs were shaking. Then I saw it. Half buried in the mud off to the side of the trail, a lantern. The same kind I'd seen burning inside that cabin. It was cold, covered in soot, and its glass was cracked. I crouched down, staring at it, feeling my hands tremble. There shouldn't have been any reason for that thing to be here. I turned around to see if someone was following me. That's when I realized the trail behind me looked different. The trees seemed closer together, darker, like the forest had changed shape somehow. I tried to retrace my steps, but the path didn't look the same anymore. I wasn't sure how far I'd gone or where I was heading. My GPS wouldn't load, and my phone battery had dropped faster than it should have. I was alone, surrounded by miles of woods, and the sound of faint, careful breathing somewhere behind me. I didn't look back right away. I couldn't. My chest felt tight, and my mouth was dry. The sound was faint but close, steady, deliberate, almost synchronized with my own breathing. I stood completely still, listening. The woods around me were motionless, not even a breeze moving through the branches. When I finally turned around, there was nothing. Just trees, endless and quiet. I waited for the sound again, but all I heard was my heartbeat in my ears. I told myself to move. I had to keep going downhill. That was the only way to reach the road. I started walking faster, every step loud in the silence. The further I went, the more the forest seemed to close in. The air grew colder, the light dimmer, even though it was still early morning. My watch said it was just after 7, but the sky above the ridge looked gray and heavy, like dusk. That's when I saw the cabin again. It shouldn't have been there. I was sure I'd walked miles in the opposite direction, but it stood ahead of me between the trees, the same slanted roof, the same broken porch. I stopped, unable to make sense of it. My throat felt tight, my breath coming in short bursts. I didn't want to go closer, but the trail seemed to lead straight to it, as if the forest had bent itself around that place. I stepped forward slowly. The door was open again, and the lantern sat on the table inside, glowing faintly. It shouldn't have been possible. I'd seen that same lantern, broken and cold miles back. This time, I didn't go inside. I stood just beyond the doorway, staring at that dim light. The air inside the cabin was different, warmer, heavier, filled with a low hum that I couldn't quite place. It wasn't a sound exactly, more like pressure in my ears. On the floor, beside the stone pile, there was something else now. A backpack. My backpack. The one I was wearing. I took a step back, instinctively grabbing for the strap on my shoulder. It was still there. I looked again. 2 identical packs, one on me, one inside that cabin. That's when I finally turned and ran. Branches scraped my arms, my boots slipped on the slope, but I didn't stop until I saw the faint shimmer of asphalt through the trees. When I burst out onto the roadside, the world felt normal again. Birds calling, the wind pushing through the grass, sunlight filtering through clouds. I stood there for a long time, gasping for air, staring back into the woods. Nothing moved. And when I reached my car, I checked my phone. The time read 5:47 p.m. Somehow, an entire day had passed. I drove until the mountains disappeared in my rearview mirror. I haven't gone back since. But sometimes, when I'm driving at night through quiet back roads, I'll see a faint orange glow between the trees. Always steady, never flickering, and I never stop to see where it's coming from. Story 9. I was driving through the Appalachian Mountains on my way to visit a friend in Tennessee. It was late, past midnight, and I'd been on the road for hours. The highway had thinned out miles back, leaving nothing but winding roads, tall pines, and the occasional flicker of an old wooden house buried in the dark. My phone had lost service about 40 minutes earlier, but I didn't think much of it. It's normal up there. The road signs started to look older, faded letters, bullet holes, rust curling around the edges. My headlights caught the shapes of trees crowding the roadside. Their shadows looked wrong somehow, too close, too tall. The night was silent, except for the low hum of my tires and the occasional creak of my suspension over the uneven asphalt. Around 1 a.m., I noticed a small side road that wasn't on my GPS map. It was narrow and looked half forgotten, the kind that disappears into the woods. I don't know why I turned. I think I just wanted to stretch my legs, maybe find a place to rest for a few minutes. The gravel road wound deeper into the trees. The branches overhead formed a canopy that blocked most of the sky. My headlights caught glimpses of old mailboxes and rotting fence posts. It looked like no one had lived there for years. After about 10 minutes, I saw a small clearing ahead, with a single cabin sitting in the center. The windows were dark, but the porch light was on. The glow was faint and yellow, like a bulb that hadn't been changed in decades. I slowed down, hesitating. The place looked old, but not abandoned. Someone might have been living there. I pulled over near the tree line, turned off the engine, and listened. The woods were silent, No wind, no insects, nothing. That kind of silence gets under your skin after a while. You start hearing your own heartbeat in your ears. I got out of the car and called out just in case someone was awake. My voice came out softer than I expected. It didn't echo, it just stopped, like the trees swallowed the sound. The porch light flickered once. That was enough for me to start walking back to my car, but before I could open the door, I saw movement by the window. Just a faint shape, like someone standing behind the glass. I froze. It didn't move again. And after a few seconds, I convinced myself it was a trick of the light. Maybe a curtain. Maybe my headlights reflecting off the glass. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The air felt heavier, like the kind that builds before a thunderstorm. I decided to leave. I got in the car, turned the key, nothing. The engine didn't even try to turn over. I tried again. Still nothing. That's when I saw the porch light flicker again, then go out completely. And in the dark, I realized something else. There were faint footprints in the dirt leading away from the cabin. But they didn't lead to my car. They stopped beside it, right next to the driver's door. I froze, with my hand still on the key. My pulse was pounding so hard it made my fingers tremble. I stared out the window, scanning the edge of the clearing. But I couldn't see anyone. Just trees and shadows stretching between them. The prints beside my car looked fresh, edges still sharp in the dirt, not softened by rain or wind. I didn't remember seeing them when I got out. I locked the doors and tried the ignition again. Nothing, not even a click. The headlights dimmed for a second, then went out completely, leaving me in total darkness. My breathing started to quicken. I reached for my phone, but the screen was dead, battery gone. I'd charged it earlier, I was sure of it. That's when I heard the faintest sound from the tree line. Not movement exactly, just the soft sound of air shifting, like someone taking a slow breath. I told myself it was the wind, but there was no wind. The trees weren't moving. I sat there for what felt like forever, trying to calm down, trying to think. My plan was to wait until daylight and then walk back to the main road. I reclined the seat a little, trying to make myself small, eyes fixed on the cabin. The porch light stayed off, and no movement came from inside. But the feeling of being watched never left. Every few minutes, I'd catch a shape between the trees, something pale, thin, just barely visible where the moonlight slipped through the branches. The more I stared, the less sure I was that it was even there. I kept blinking, trying to make sense of it. At some point, exhaustion and fear mixed together, and I must have drifted in and out of sleep. I remember waking up to find the windshield fogged from my breath, the air inside cold enough to see it. I wiped the glass with my sleeve and saw something that made my stomach drop. More footprints. Not just beside the car this time, around it. Circling. There must have been a dozen of them, all pressed deep into the damp dirt. Some smaller, some larger, as if more than one person had been there. None of them led away. They just stopped, disappearing beneath the car. I stayed frozen for minutes, barely breathing, afraid to move. Then, slowly, I leaned forward to look through the windshield again toward the cabin. The porch light was back on. Only now it wasn't the same dim yellow. It was bright white, almost too bright, spilling across the clearing and into the trees. And in that light, I could see the door was open. Not wide, just enough that I could make out the edge of something standing in the doorway. It didn't move, it didn't step forward. It just stood there watching. I sat there, frozen, staring through the windshield. My first thought was that maybe it was someone who lived there, a local who'd heard my car. But the longer I looked, the less that idea made sense. The figure was too still, too rigid. The light from the porch poured over it, but no details stood out. No color, no face, no movement. Just a tall, motionless shape framed in the doorway. I don't know how long I stared. My breathing was shallow, my chest tight. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears, fast and uneven. I thought about turning the key again, about running out into the woods, but every instinct screamed at me to stay quiet, to stay still. Eventually, the porch light dimmed slightly, and when my eyes adjusted, the doorway was empty. The shape was gone. I waited. A minute passed, then 2. The silence pressed in again. I couldn't take it anymore. I forced myself to reach for the ignition, praying for a miracle. The engine started. I didn't think. I slammed the car into reverse, turned hard, and sped back down that gravel road faster than I should have. The trees blurred by, the headlights bouncing over rocks and dips, and the sound of gravel spraying under the tires. I didn't dare look in the mirrors. It felt like that road went on forever. Finally, after what had to be 10 or 15 minutes, I hit pavement again. The instant my tires touched asphalt, my phone lit up with a weak signal. I didn't stop driving until I reached a small gas station, miles down the highway. When I got out of the car, I felt lightheaded, like I'd been holding my breath the entire time. The clerk inside gave me a weird look when I came in, pale and shaking. I told him my car had died near an old cabin off the side road. He frowned and said there weren't any cabins out that way anymore. They'd all been torn down years ago after a fire. I didn't argue. I just thanked him, bought a coffee, and sat in the parking lot until sunrise. Before I left, I looked at the side of my car. There were streaks of dirt and scratches along the door like someone had run their hands or something rough across the metal. I never went back. But sometimes, when I drive through that stretch of mountains at night, my headlights will catch something white at the edge of the trees, and for just a second, it looks like someone standing perfectly still, watching the road. I always keep driving. I don't slow down. Because whatever I saw that night in the Appalachians, I don't think it ever stopped watching me. Story 10. I'll never forget that night in the Appalachians. It started as a simple hiking trip. I'd been planning it for months. 2 days alone on an old ridge trail near the Tennessee-North Carolina border. I wanted to clear my head, take some photos, and get away from the noise of work and people for a while. I wasn't new to camping, but that trip made me realize how little I really understood about being alone out there. The first day went fine. The trail was narrow and steep in parts, but the air was cool and the forest smelled like pine and damp soil. I reached a small clearing by late afternoon and decided to camp there for the night. The sun set early behind the ridge and the forest grew quiet almost instantly. No crickets, no owls, just the faint sound of wind moving through the branches high above me. I remember sitting by my little fire, watching the last light fade, when I realized how far I was from anyone else. My car was nearly 8 miles back down the mountain. There wasn't a single house or ranger station anywhere nearby. I thought about that silence again. It wasn't peaceful. It was too complete, like the woods were holding their breath. I tried to ignore it, told myself it was just the altitude or the cold air. After dinner, I put out the fire and crawled into my tent. I listened to my own breathing in the dark, slow and uneven. I kept waiting for the usual night sounds to start. The chirps, the wind, but there was nothing. Just that heavy, still quiet pressing down from every direction. Sometime after midnight, I woke up. No reason, just that sudden, alert kind of waking where you know something's wrong before your brain can name it. My heart was already racing. The air inside the tent felt colder, like someone had unzipped it while I was sleeping. I listened. At first, all I heard was my own breathing. Then I realized I wasn't the only one breathing. There was another sound, faint but steady, just outside the tent. Slow, deep breaths, like someone standing close enough for me to hear the air moving through their throat. I didn't move. My whole body went rigid, eyes wide open in the dark. I tried to convince myself it was an animal, maybe a deer or a bear, but I knew it wasn't. The breathing was too slow, too controlled. It stayed there for what felt like minutes, maybe longer. Then, just as quietly, it stopped. The silence came back, heavier than before. I waited another hour before daring to unzip the tent. My flashlight beam cut through the misty air, landing on trees, wet leaves, and the faint shape of my dying fire pit. Nothing else? No tracks, no movement. But when I turned the light toward the ground near the entrance of my tent, my stomach dropped. There were footprints, bare ones, too small to belong to me and too fresh to have been there before. I froze, staring at those footprints. The edges were sharp, pressed deep into the damp soil, and they led toward the trees behind, my campsite. They weren't animal prints, and they weren't distorted like a boot mark. They were clean, human, bare feet. The strange part was how they stopped just a few steps from my tent. There were no prints leading to or away from that spot, just those few, as if whoever it was had appeared there and vanished. I kept my flashlight trained on them for a long time, trying to steady my breathing. My throat felt dry, and my pulse was pounding so hard I could feel it in my temples. I finally gathered enough nerve to whisper out a shaky "hello" into the dark. My voice came out hoarse, barely a sound at all. No reply. The forest gave nothing back. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I just sat there, inside the tent, with my flashlight on, every muscle tensed, waiting for something to move or breathe again. But nothing happened. When the sky finally started to turn gray, I stepped out to check the area. The footprints were still there, no new ones. Just the same perfect impressions, slowly filling with morning dew. I packed up my things fast. Every sound, the zipper, the crunch of my boots, even the rustle of fabric, felt too loud in that empty forest. I wanted to get back to the trail as quickly as possible. But when I reached the ridge line, I noticed something strange. The air had changed. It was colder now, even though the sun was up. My breath came out in short white puffs. The woods around me were covered in this thin, bluish mist I hadn't seen the day before. I tried to keep moving, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every few minutes, I'd glance behind me. Nothing. Then I'd swear I saw something pale moving between the trees, just for a second, like a shoulder, or maybe a hand disappearing behind a trunk. I told myself it was fog playing tricks on me, but deep down, I didn't believe that. Around midday, I reached an old wooden signpost. It looked like it hadn't been touched in decades, the words carved into it worn smooth by time. I brushed away some moss and could barely make out the words. Carter Ridge, Old Settlement Trail. I hadn't seen that name on any of my maps. Still, I followed it, thinking it would lead me down faster. The trail was overgrown and narrow, weaving through thick underbrush. After about half an hour, I started to notice something odd about the trees. They were carved. Every few yards, there'd be a mark cut into the bark, small, shallow symbols I didn't recognize. Some looked like stick figures, others like circles or spirals. Some were arranged in pairs, almost like faces without eyes. By the time I realized how many of them there were, it was already too late to turn back. I kept walking, though every step felt heavier than the last. The forest was silent now, no birds, no insects, not even the wind through the leaves. The quiet pressed against me, thick and suffocating, until I could hear my own heartbeat echo in my ears. The trail curved sharply downhill, and that's when I saw it. What looked like the remains of a small settlement deep in the hollow. A few wooden cabins leaned at odd angles. Their roofs caved in, and a crumbling stone well sat at the center. I felt drawn toward it, though I couldn't explain why. When I got closer, I noticed something hanging from one of the cabin doors. Bundles of twigs tied together with old rope. They looked like little human shapes, maybe charms or warnings. I reached out to touch one, but stopped halfway. It wasn't just twigs. There were bones mixed in, tiny ones. I backed away, my pulse racing. That's when I heard something. Slow movement, like someone shifting their weight inside the cabin. The door creaked open just an inch. I didn't wait to see more. I turned and ran, pushing through the brush and branches tearing at my sleeves. I don't remember how long I ran, but at some point I stumbled onto a dirt road. My legs were shaking, lungs burning. The mist had thinned, and I could finally see the outline of the mountains again. I followed that road until I reached a ranger station hours later. When I told them where I'd been, the ranger just stared at me for a long time before shaking his head. He said there hadn't been a settlement out there for nearly 100 years, that the last people who'd lived on Carter Ridge vanished after a landslide wiped most of the town away. He must have seen the look on my face because he added, almost gently, that locals still avoided that part of the mountain. He said the woods there don't let go of things easily. I didn't tell him about the footprints or the carvings or the figure I thought I saw by the cabin door. But sometimes, when I think back on that morning mist, I wonder if something from that place followed me out. Because every now and then, when I go hiking alone, I'll find the same symbol carved into a tree, fresh, clean, and waiting for me to see it.